I'm here with Gerald Butts, the CEO of WWF-Canada. And I wanted to start off by asking you about your perspective on Keystone XL, and in particular, if this has fundamentally changed the Canada-U.S. relationship.
I'll start with the second part of the question. I don't think it has fundamentally changed the Canada-U.S. relationship. I think the decision by the Obama administration is largely political in nature. And I think, like many, I'm suspecting, though I'm not entirely happy about it, but I think they'll probably approve the Keystone Pipeline after the election, regardless of who occupies the White House. So I think from time to time, historically, each government has made decisions like this for political reasons, and this is one of those. It's in that category.
One of the most interesting dynamics that emerged with Keystone was this radicalization of the environmental movement, particularly south of the border.
At least the characterization of the environmental movement as radical.
Okay, well, could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Look, I think one of the most unhelpful consequences of the Keystone decision is the acceleration of the Northern Gateway pipeline process and the tenor that the public debate about the Northern Gateway pipeline has taken on. You know, that most Canadians don't know this because it hasn't been characterized this way, but the route for the Northern Gateway is directly through the last intact temperate rainforest on Earth. And that's just the pipeline infrastructure. The much bigger environmental risk, of course, is the tanker traffic that would go in and out of the Great Bear Sea 200-300 times a year. And we just I don't think that there's a plan in place to mitigate this risk. So we ought not to be talking about how we accelerate the discussion. More, we ought to be talking about the bigger picture issue of a national energy strategy and why are we in such a rush to extract this resource in the first place.
Now, I'm interested in your recent op-ed in the Globe and Mail. You mentioned the hypocrisy of the fact that there are Canadians lobbying in the U.S. and vice versa. And so does this energy plan have to be a continental vision? Is it a continental problem?
It's a global problem. I think it has to take into account continental reality and, where possible, take advantage of continental opportunities. But we ought to have a robust sense of our own possibilities from an energy perspective. And to date, the national discussion on energy has almost been entirely circumscribed around fossil fuels. We have abundant sources of geothermal, solar, wind, hydro energy that aren't part of that conversation. So it ought to be a more balanced one. That's my perspective on it.
Absolutely. Now, I want to shift to the politics of the environmental policy and where you think this federal government is going. And you brought up the possibility that maybe other actors, subnational actors, need to get involved in the discourse. Where is their potential?
Well, I think there have been really constructive conversations between Ontario and Quebec over the last little while, and there's even, although I hesitate to even say this, hope against hope, there's even some discussion between Newfoundland, Labrador, the rest of Atlantic Canada, and the potential, at least, to bring the Lower Churchill project into central Canada, which would be a great thing for the country's carbon footprint in the end. And in some ways, I think the national government can serve the country best by staying out of that discussion, because it sometimes complicates matters. But I think that the federal government is reflecting its political roots by equating fossil fuels with energy. And I think that's, I won't ascribe motives, or somebody else could talk about those things, but I think it's a really unfortunate thing for the country because we have a lot more to offer ourselves in the world than the oil sands.
Yesterday, Ian Bremmer, head of the Eurasia Group, from Davos, wrote this argument in favor of a new regionally based global order. And he's kind of described it as a second best option. As in, climate change really should have a global solution, but global solutions have failed. And in the discussion today, you talked about a devolution work towards regional solutions. Do you think a North American cooperative agreement on something like climate change and energy policy is a second best solution to global?
I'm not so sure it is, because I think that in order for solutions to be enduring, especially in democratic societies like the ones we enjoy in North America, the citizens have to see themselves reflected in them and have the ability to shape and mold those solutions over time. And one of the biggest problems the Kyoto process ran into was citizens in all kinds of countries felt that they, and let's face it, large economic actors in certain key countries, felt that they had no control over the outcome and didn't see themselves reflected in those institutions. I think that's a much broader, well, maybe there's no bigger issue we're facing than climate change, but it's certainly a much more pervasive issue than just on environmental issues. I think we're seeing it in a crisis of confidence in the WTO, in just about every transnational global institution, from the UN to the FAO to you name it. I think there's a lot less confidence in those bodies than there have been in the past. And I think that's reflective of a growing maturity in civil society, or I shouldn't say maturity, a growing awareness in civil society about these problems, and an organic growth in the ability through social media for citizens and civil society groups to connect with one another across boundaries that simply didn't exist when the Bretton Woods institutions were envisioned.